Now to the issue of climate policy, and as state and territory leaders prepare to discuss whether to back the Finkel review at that COAG meeting tomorrow, the federal Shadow Environment Minister has released a book about the failure of our politicians across the spectrum to find a solution to climate change.
The book is called Climate Wars, and Shadow Environment Minister Mark Butler joins us in the studio now. Very good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So in this book, you're very critical about Australia's climate change policy. You call it policy paralysis. Tell us about that.
Well, that's right. It really has been a lost decade of policy mistakes and ultimately policy paralysis, which has been, I think, characterised by a campaign of reckless vandalism in this policy area that has sought to build a case to do nothing. And because of that, we're essentially doing nothing. We're seeing pollution going up. We're seeing jobs, particularly in renewable energy, go backwards. But around the world, the private sector and other governments are taking action. They're starting to reap the benefits of a shift to a low-carbon economy.
By speaking of the last decade, you of course include the Rudd and Gillard governments there. We recall Kevin Rudd declaring climate change the greatest moral challenge of our time, then quickly walking away from efforts to deal with it. So everybody's culpable here.
Well, that's right, and I think Kevin's been honest about the mistake he made in dropping the carbon pollution reduction scheme in 2010 and not taking it to an election. I think Julia's been honest about the tactical mistakes we made in time. Also, I think we're proud of the things that we did do in government that were good. I mean, massive expansion in renewable energy jobs, in rooftop solar for households, and in big renewable energy projects. We saw carbon pollution come down. So I think people must be honest about their role in the last 10 years. And the Labor Party, I think, has tried to be honest about that.
And in this book, you also make a case for using less and cleaner energy. What is that case? How do we do this while keeping costs down?
Well, in 2015, renewable energy investment around the world was larger than the combined investment in coal and gas and hydro and nuclear. And it's just continued to grow and grow all around the world, not just in developed economies, but in China and India as well. It is now the cheapest form of new electricity, and it brings jobs, it brings investment, and it really positions Australia to be a leader in innovation as well. But particularly for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been hampered by these continual attacks on the renewable energy industry, while you've seen enormous growth elsewhere in the world.
So how hardly should that figure into this meeting tomorrow of the energy ministers? We have this big battery proposed in South Australia, but still different points of view from across the spectrum as to whether such a proposal would work.
Well, I think the broad response in industry and in the community, certainly my state of South Australia, has been very positive about Elon Musk coming to Australia and building the world's largest battery. There's a lot more to do in this area. The storage revolution is proceeding at an incredibly fast pace, and it's going to change the way in which we can deploy renewable energy. As for the meeting tomorrow, I think the federal government, the Turnbull government, is a bit paralysed by their inability to get something through the coalition party room. Hopefully that will change in August. We've indicated a willingness to sit down with them and finally put in place a bipartisan energy policy framework. But as of yet, Malcolm Turnbull and Josh Frydenberg haven't yet got the authority to do that with us.
One of the things that the federal government is doing in lead up to COAG is ramping up pressure on the states to basically lift those gas exploration plans. Is this something that you agree with?
Well, we think there should be a discussion about responsible onshore development of gas, but wagging the prime ministerial finger from Canberra is not going to deal with the very significant community unrest that you see in New South Wales and Victoria and other parts of the country as well. You need to put in place a framework that nurtures community consent to these developments, not simply tries to lecture it away. And that's been my criticism of Malcolm Turnbull's approach to this.
But there's a considerable amount of gas reserves in states like Victoria and territories like the Northern Territory. If we're talking about all options being on the table, surely these bans should be looked at, as the federal government is calling for?
Well, the NT is going through a process of a public inquiry headed by a very eminent person, and I think they should be allowed to continue to do that. That will be done by the end of this year. Victoria is already an exporter of gas. It already produces more gas than it uses.
It could do a whole lot more, though, without those gas reserves.
Well, there is still a debate about how much onshore gas there is and how quickly that could be got out of the ground. But as I say, the sort of political attacks from Canberra are not going to help the Andrews government or federal governments work through the significant community opposition that you do find in Victoria to those developments. We need to try to nurture a framework that gives community confidence that these developments can proceed in a way that doesn't damage their water supply in particular.
Look, there is another policy that has been discussed, and that's the stricter fuel emissions on cars. Now, Opposition Leader Bill Shorten has come out and said this is something that he would potentially support. But you've got the automotive industry who's saying if you put these stricter emissions in place, it's going to increase significantly the cost of family cars. If that's the case, would Labor still support this?
Well, more than 3 years ago, the government received a report from the Climate Change Authority that simply recommended that Australia bring its emission standards for cars and light trucks into line with America. Now, 80% of the global car market has these emission standards. Australian car rooms sell dirtier versions of global brands like the Corolla and others, dirtier versions than you legally can buy in the UK or in North America or in Europe. This is just silly. I mean, we should just get on with putting in place emission standards that mean that our car fleet is the same as the car fleet of every other advanced economy.
But if these cars cost thousands of dollars more in a country where, you know, that we've already got very high energy prices, you've got record low wage growth, how do people afford these lower emissions cars?
Well, I don't understand how the government has managed to muddle this up. I don't know what the so-called carbon tax or the carbon penalty on these standards is. That wasn't the recommendation of the Climate Change Authority. It wasn't our policy that we took to the last election. It's simply a case of putting standards in place that would lead, we know from experience elsewhere, to very significant fuel savings for Australian consumers.
All right, Mark Butler, great having you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.